Welcome to another ORF Digital Conversation. I'm Ritika Passi. I'm with ORF's Strategic Studies program. Ongoing and recent developments in the Indo-Pacific are sharpening tensions and amplifying uncertainty in what is quickly becoming the 21st century's primary security theater. With me today is Professor Rory Medcalf from Australian National University. We had the pleasure of hosting Professor Medcalf recently on an ORF webinar to discuss his latest book, Context for the Indo-Pacific, Why China Won't Map the Future. We have the link in the video description. Please do check it out. I'm pleased to welcome Professor Medcalf back, this time to discuss the contested Indo-Pacific theater in light of recent developments and the evolving assessment of Australia's role and responsibility in this space. Hi, Professor Medcalf.
Pleasure to join you.
So jumping straight in, increasing instances of Chinese assertiveness, aggressiveness, posturing vis-a-vis its Indo-Pacific neighbors abound. Whether it's the latest border conflict with India or the tariffs it has slapped on Australian beef and barley, or of course, its continuing activities in the contested East and South China Seas. How are Indo-Pacific countries straining bilateral ties with China, implicating the Indo-Pacific construct, and more importantly, its institutionalization?
So you captured it really neatly, I think. The term I've used in something that I've just written about China is hubristic folly. It's extraordinary how many countries, how much of international opinion the Chinese Communist Party is managing to alienate at the same time. We've just had an opinion poll in Australia that shows that a record low of around 20% of Australians essentially trust China to act responsibly in the world, and most of those would trust it only to act somewhat responsibly. So you're absolutely right, and of course in India, I think you felt, I guess in many ways, the ugliest brunt of that kind of coercion. How are we all responding, and how does this fit with, I guess, an Indo-Pacific concept? I mean, in my book, which you've mentioned, which was published some months ago now, but which I think is disturbingly current in some ways, the large geographic canvas of the Indo-Pacific region, in other words, bringing together East Asia, South Asia, Australasia, our ties to North America, and I guess the interests of the global system in our region. This is providing a stage for, I guess, for coordination and solidarity in managing this coercive Chinese power. We haven't seen the full extent of that coordination and solidarity yet, and it's going to be hard in various ways, and we can come to that. But we're certainly at a diplomatic level, we're seeing unprecedented levels of, I guess, the kind of preparatory dialogue that you would see before more coordinated action. So obviously some really interesting bilaterals, Australia and India forming a strategic partnership only a few weeks ago. As we record this evening, I think it's on the 9th of July, the Australian and Japanese Prime Ministers are holding their own virtual leaders meeting. There's now not only a healthy quadrilateral dialogue, but a Quad Plus dialogue bringing in Vietnam, South Korea and New Zealand to look at really how we get through this COVID year. So I think that in many ways China is building the balancing behaviour that it doesn't want to see. Lots of question marks there because, of course, a lot of commentators would say that all of this Indo-Pacific balancing and coalition forming doesn't really matter until we get to moments of absolute confrontation where our countries need to take risks for one another. And we will get to that, I suspect.
Picking up just from where you've left it off, clearly it seems that the necessity to build some kind of regional security architecture, it seems imperative in face of an assessment of a less benign environment that we're seeing today shape up. And you've referenced several bilateral defense cooperation strengthening between India, the US, Australia, and other Indo-Pacific countries. We've also been seeing an increase in trilateral and minilateral arrangements, whether it's India, Singapore, Thailand's maritime exercise for the first time last year, or of course the India, Australia, Indonesia working group that we've seen some pickup on. But how do you see these sort of mini-lateral arrangements and these strengthening of bilateral two-way defense and security arrangements? How do you see that holding up in the place of an overarching or a common security architecture?
Look, good question. I mean, I think, in many ways we're seeing a very crowded landscape at the moment of diplomatic initiatives. The mini-laterals you talk about, all those trilaterals, obviously the quadrilateral with the United States, the others that I've mentioned. But a lot of the really effective work is going to keep happening at the bilaterals. Australia and India, Australia and Japan, India and Japan, all of us still with the United States, even under the kind of the dysfunction of the Trump administration. So I see a kind of a three-layered architecture, and I guess time will tell how that resolves, but the three layers are the bilaterals, the mini-laterals, and don't forget multilateralism as well. I don't think our countries have yet made fully effective use of, for example, the East Asia Summit or the other ASEAN-centric architecture. It's quite possible also that we'll see effective mini-laterals that reach beyond the Indo-Pacific. Let's see how the G7 evolves, whether the idea of bringing India, Australia, and potentially others into that architecture, whether that has an impact. And I think it could, particularly on issues to do with supply chain security, geoeconomic security, human rights, Hong Kong, and so forth. But we are in a state of flux and ferment, and a lot will depend on the resources that our countries are willing to put into these arrangements. Bilaterals will remain the building blocks, and that's why I'm especially heartened by what countries like Australia and India can do together. If our navies can train effectively together in trusted areas like anti-submarine warfare, if we can begin to develop dialogue that's trusted and effective on cyber and on space with countries like Japan and India, we have at least the kind of ballast that we need to hold the line as perhaps the United States gathers its wits for the decade of contestation with China that lies ahead. We will, I think, give pause to China and complicate China's decisions and choices, but certainly it will take a few more big strategic developments before these arrangements, I guess before the cards begin to fall and we see which of these minilaterals, which of these bilaterals are the true pillars for regional security. We have a lot to choose from at the moment.
But I assume that the direction, however, assessing the situation, the direction seems clear. Moving forward as countries individually and with, in bilateral or trilateral or other minilateral arrangements, develop their own resources and capacities that eventually, given, how the conflict or the security situation deteriorates or improves in this space, that the end aim has to be some kind of a networked whole, between these individual arrangements. I assume that's where the direction seems to be.
Look, that would be my assessment. Obviously, we can never predict the future, and there could be strategic ruptures. But I think the big rupture that's come with COVID-19. 3 or 4 months ago, some of us, including me, and I've invested a lot in thinking about these issues, would have said we have to question our assumptions. Could it be that, in fact, as our countries turn inwards to deal with the shock of COVID-19 or prioritise, as we should, the pandemic response, does this mean that somehow the whole trend of Indo-Pacific strategic cooperation gets thrown off course, gets changed, gets revisited? Actually, it's been accelerated by this age of disruption, partly, I think, because of that Chinese overconfidence and the way in which the PRC has used this window, not for renewing its charm offensive or subordinating its strategic imperatives, but for doing exactly the opposite. I guess a big consideration for us, though, is the question of whether China will continue to try to isolate some of our countries individually, basically through individual acts of coercion, persuade a country like Australia or India that it is effectively alone in the international system, and also use its own methods such as interference and influence operations to affect internal political and public opinion to basically discourage the kind of self-respecting pushback that we are seeing at the moment. And I guess that in many ways is what's going to be in play, because we've come a long way, but there are some big decisions that lie ahead, such as, for example, the decisions that some countries, including India, take on critical infrastructure, on 5G, and on really what price we're willing to pay, including here in Australia, what price we're willing to pay to protect our interests in the long term against the misuse of Chinese power.
And this leads me directly into my next question, which is that you mentioned the COVID, black swan event, so to speak. There's already been this sort of growing conversation on debt and how much countries owe China and the role that China is playing in supply chains. That has become accelerated or accentuated. It's come front and center with, of course, COVID and its immediate aftermath, and of course the reverberations that we're still feeling and will continue to feel in the foreseeable future. India, for example, now in addressing its border, the border issue, has, for instance, banned 59 apps and is reviewing a number of Chinese investments. India is by no means the only country to have started to do so. As you've mentioned, clearly a longer term strategy is required as governments, figure out domestically what changes they need to institute to build resilience, to shore up capacities, to decrease power differentials, individual power differentials vis-a-vis dominant power in the region. What are, in your estimation, structures or processes that can be pursued jointly, even as individual efforts persevere, that can be pursued jointly among Indo-Pacific partners to effectively, help their own individual efforts in narrowing this power differential beyond the military sphere?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is certainly much more than military. In fact, military is going to be only one dimension, and maybe not the most important dimension of the many-layered contest for the Indo-Pacific that we're entering. Look, I would focus on two things. One is that we have to continue to look to resilience domestically, resilience at home, and look to really make our societies and our economies a little bit more, a little bit less vulnerable, I should say, to economic coercion and leverage. And that's going to be hard. In fact, that will involve and is involving all sorts of short-term difficulty. But of course, it's short-term difficulty that we're going through anyway in many regards, because of the way that the COVID-19 shock has disrupted the international trading system, has disrupted our economic trajectories. And in many ways, I think, when China threatens economic coercion against our countries, as I've argued, it's kind of a strange kind of wolf warrior diplomacy, because in a sense, it reminds me of the tale of the three little pigs. It's just that the big bad wolf has already blown the house down, even if it's accidentally through COVID, and therefore it's a little bit rich for the wolf now to be threatening economic harm on us when so much has already been inflicted. But it is going to be difficult, and it will involve really painful political choices, and there's no guarantee that our governments are all willing to make those choices. I do think, though, that over the medium term, we will see greater diversification and resilience, particularly in supply chains. And I would say that that's where the second stage of my suggested blueprint, kind of an obvious blueprint, and that is the coordination and the dialogue that we need. So we need regular, close dialogue between our countries, not just India and Australia, but also in the Quad, and also Quad Plus, if you like, arrangements, where we look at supply chain security, we look at critical technologies, we look at critical minerals like rare earths, we look at energy, and we look at the ways in which we can maintain at least a kind of a sufficiency of these essential elements of national development and national power in the face of future black swans or black elephants or coercion from China. It's not about complete decoupling from China, which I think even in the United States is an unrealistic ambition, but it is much more about diversification and redundancy. And I should also add, which may be a little bit controversial, but I also would add that Taiwan needs to be a part of those conversations somehow, even if it's through track 2 rather than government to government conversations, because Taiwan, Vietnam, a whole lot of countries in Southeast Asia as well, I think could, and Europe could all be part of this conversation. And I guess over time, it would be nice to have processes on resilience, critical infrastructure, supply chains, where in fact China wants to be part of the conversation again, because when that happens, I think collectives of our countries can begin setting some kind of basic conditions for that re-engagement. But I guess I'm moving to a fairly distant horizon here.
And I guess in the meantime, so to speak, the more immediate, the low-hanging fruit, I suppose, are to look for ways in which Indo-Pacific partners can effectively also invest in each other's development. I know for a fact that, for instance, Australia has invested in India's National Investment and Infrastructure Fund, for instance, right? And of course, when it comes to building supply chains and connectivity, there is some engagement that seems to be materializing, but that obviously needs to be accelerated. Just as the security assessment seems to be accelerating, the response also now needs to pick up. And in fact, you've actually preempted the next question that I wanted to ask, which references effectively this point on the role or the space that China occupies, you know, beyond just its territory, just the sheer scale and size of China. And it references a statement that you had made actually in the book discussion that we had with you previously, which was that as much as China bats against this notion or the construct of Indo-Pacific, China is effectively the most Indo-Pacific nation of all. So are there then limits to this ideal multi-networked Indo-Pacific, you know, that seeks to, through the pursuit of a principled rules-based order, through that it seeks to check coercive behavior, you know, Chinese coercive behavior. So I think that's something that is something to sort of maybe explore further as well. You know, what are the sort of limits and how can a whole come out of these pieces, as we also don't forget that bilateral dependencies remain and will remain for the foreseeable future. So it's not a one or either. It's not an either or situation here that we're talking about. I want to now bring the conversation, to end the conversation, to bring it to the question of Australia specifically. Just a couple of days ago, we've seen Australia release its 2020 Defense Strategic Force Update and Force Structure Plan. If I could ask you first, what are the key takeaways that we need to pay attention to?
Sure, I'll get to that. I mean, I just want to quickly touch on your earlier point, though, about the Indo-Pacific, because in fact, I guess what I like about these questions is that in fact, they're sparking new thoughts and new ideas. And I think one thought that we probably haven't done enough to explore yet is the way in which China's almost, although China was the country that I would argue, in a sense, created the modern Indo-Pacific through its expansion of interest and influence into the Indian Ocean and South Asia and Africa with its energy dependence and then its Belt and Road and so forth. It's actually also prompting this kind of parallel architecture that's now being designed. For example, the coordination of Australian, Indian, Japanese and other parallel infrastructure and investment initiatives. And even if they are smaller than BRI, in many cases, particularly with the Japanese on board, they're of higher quality. And I think what we'll see in the end is, as you say, a very, very networked region where in fact the Chinese role won't be the only or even necessarily the integral glue. And that way, in a way, others will be able to set conditions for their engagement with China. But going to your question about the Australian defence policy, look, I think that is quite big news. It's not quite as dramatic as some of the headlines in India and elsewhere have suggested. It's not actually a 40% increase in Australian defence spending, but it is a 40% increase in the declared figure for Australian defence investment in capability over the next 10 years, which of course is it's a subset of overall defence spending. So you could say in a sense that Australia is going to be allocating more of its already substantial defence spending each year into new capability, advanced capability, capability that is importantly about deterrence in many ways, not nuclear deterrence, but strong conventional deterrence, and an ability to strike out where necessary at distance to deter the kinds of actions we don't want to see, but also to respond to them if we need to. I think that this is significant for the region, for India and others in the region, because it will make Australia an increasingly credible and capable security partner. We can't look after all of our defence ourselves. We do have the alliance with the United States, but there will be more we can do with others, especially in the maritime sphere. Australia's going to become increasingly self-reliant in its intelligence, communications and targeting, which is absolutely vital. And I would say in new technologies, for example, research in hypersonic weapons, Australia is going to become a much more serious player. And I don't think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that this necessarily is about sort of an arms racing or a security dilemma dynamic, because in many ways, we've all been pretty restrained in our defence policies over the past 10 to 20 years, and that hasn't stopped China from taking the path that it's taken. But I think instead, it's about Australia encouraging its partners in the region to do what we're doing, and again, to build that defensive and collaborative network that you've alluded to.
Thank you so much, Professor Medcalf. As always, much food for thought. And thank you for watching us. And we look forward to bringing you more conversations on the changing landscape of the Indo-Pacific region.
Thanks so much. Great conversation. All the best.